Right, so good evening, everyone. I just want to remind everybody that this is going to be recorded. So as Catherine mentioned, my name is Patrick Leombro, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight, and specifically wanted to extend a thank you to our friends at Hubtown Tours for their support of the Old North Digital Speaker Series. At Old North, we're committed to sharing the stories of all people and communities that are part of our site's physical, spiritual, and social history. The Old North Church sits on land that was once the land of the Massachusetts people. By the time that Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been driven and displaced from their homes, but they did not disappear, and nor should their stories and their memories. I just want to give a little heads up of the next speaker series and an upcoming production that's going to be taking place at Old North. So the next speaker series event is going to be on Wednesday, May 15th. It's titled Silent No More, Women in the Haitian Revolution. It's going to be with Dr. Crystal Nicole Edens, the Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. In this history talk, she will draw on African and African diaspora perspectives to shed light on the ways that enslaved women may have contributed to the revolution for freedom and liberation after the Haitian Revolution of 1791. She'll be drawing her conversation from her book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora. We're going to put a link to that in the event registration in the chat in the sidebar momentarily, so you can register for that. Also in the chat, we're going to be including registration and information about Revolution's Edge, which is an original theatrical work. It's commissioned by the Old North Illuminated and produced by Plays in Place. That's going to be opening on June 7th, and it's going to be running through August 10th, in which the performers are going to transport us to the afternoon of April 18th, 1775, hours before the signal lanterns would shine from Old North Steeple, and takes the guests on a journey through exploring the intersection of faith and freedom on the edge of the American Revolution. The performance is approximately 45 minutes. Seating for the play starts at 5:30, and the show begins promptly at 6. Ticket holders are also welcome to explore the Old North Church's sanctuary and new history exhibit between 5:30 and 6 before the show starts. So tonight, we welcome our guest speaker, Russ Lopez. That's why we're all here. Drawing from his book, The Hub of the Gay Universe, an LGBTQ History of Boston, Provincetown, and Beyond, Russ will be leading the discussion from queer Puritans to marriage equality in the Commonwealth. Russ is a historian and author based in Provincetown and the South End of Boston. He's worked at City Hall and the State House and has decades of experience with LGBTQ plus and straight politics. With his master's from Harvard and a doctorate from Boston University, Lopez's scholarship is focused on urban studies and the issues affecting people who live in cities, especially those who are often disenfranchised or rarely have an opportunity to have their voices heard. So before we get started, I just want to remind everybody to please make sure that your microphone has been muted. And we will be answering questions at the end of the conversation. So again, feel free to submit your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring it throughout, and we'll be getting to that at the end. So with that, I'll hand the reins over now to Russ Lopez to take us on this fascinating journey of LGBTQ plus history here in the Commonwealth.
Thank you so much. Let me try to do the share the screen thing here so that I can get this going here. Hopefully, and then from the beginning, does it all work? Of course, it stops in the middle. There we go. I think that's it, right? You'll tell me if I'm doing something wrong here.
Yeah.
My grandmother always told me that machines, particularly computers, are kind of alive, and they know when you're depending on them, and that's when they mess up. They kind of have this puckish personality. But thank you so much to the folks at Old North Church and for letting me do this, because I like to talk and I'm very excited about my work. And I'm going to do my best not to talk too quickly because I do get excited about these sorts of things. I should also say that I'm not a religion historian, but I have been fascinated by this whole central issue. How did these people, the very name Puritan, the word puritanical, how did these people who were so conservative and so feared for their conservatism, how did they end up creating this state that, hundreds of years later is one of the most liberal places in the United States? To me, that's a fascinating thing, because they're, in a sense, I don't want to compare Puritans to dinosaurs, but the dinosaurs became birds, right? And the Puritans became the liberal folks of Massachusetts. And that to me is fascinating. So we're going to talk a lot, really this lecture's in two pieces. One is sort of way back when, and then one is the events around marriage, because they're a little bit more complicated than most people know. And the religious part of the Unitarians and the Congregationalists, the heirs of the Puritans and the Pilgrims, had played a major role in the fight for same-sex marriage in Massachusetts and therefore the country. And so that's the two parts of the lecture, with a little bit of a hinge to tell you some of the things that went on between the very old days and the newer days. So let's get going. That is the key question. Why Massachusetts? Why Puritans and Pilgrims? These folks, again, didn't go away. They just transformed themselves into the two most progressive denominations around. And so just to sort of give you a little bit of overview here, we're going to talk get a lot about the Puritans and how they felt about same-sex marriage and how they sort of modeled the religious universe around them, and how that actually sort of set the stage for this liberalization that then happened, 300 years later, 400 years later almost, that the state first, the Supreme Judicial Court, which is this Massachusetts Supreme Court's name, and they end up ruling for same-sex marriage. And then after that, after 2003, 2004, for the next 4 years, the battle was in the state legislature, which is also called the Great and General Court, just to confuse everybody, and how those religious institutions helped the battle for same-sex marriage. These heirs of the Pilgrims and Puritans were the ones who sort of were central to this coalition that got same-sex marriage approved. So to understand the Puritans and Pilgrims, you have to go back to 16th century England. It all comes back to Henry VIII, no matter where we go here. But Europe itself was kind of a mess right now in those years. The Catholic Church, which had been, sort of the savior of civilization since the fall of Rome, was kind of creaking under its own internal divisions. It needed money. They were selling, redemption to people. They had a big bureaucracy to support. It was really kind of ripe for somebody going after them. And you found, at least at the beginning, there were two men, and I apologize that so much of this beginning of this talk is going to be about men, because they're the kind of reflects the power of folks back in the day. But anyway, two men, Martin Luther, who nails his theses on a church in 1517, and then John Calvin, who was French, but more down in Geneva. They were the ones who sort of started the Protestant Reformation. And at first it looked like England might sort of bypass that. I think at one point the Pope called King Henry VIII like the protector of Catholicism or something crazy like that. But there were a bunch of reasons why he wanted to break with the church. The most important one, which we all know, is that he wanted an heir, and he needed to divorce his wife to do so. But the other reason that economists and other folks point out is that he really wanted the wealth of the church, which was this great untapped source of money. As people would die, give legacies, or they would give money to the church for various things, the church built up incredible wealth, as opposed to the non-clerical folk people, who would waste it on, raising kids or fighting each other or whatnot. So this wealth of the church was very tempting to a man who didn't know how to make a budget. So for whatever reason, a bunch of reasons, in 1534, he broke with Rome and declared himself head of the church. So at this point now, you have all this ferment in England. So most of there's the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans. The Pilgrims were separatists. They would follow John Calvin for the most part, rather than Luther. I don't know why that's the case, but it is. And they wanted nothing to do with all the evilness around them. They didn't like the Catholics. They didn't trust the new Anglican Church. They just thought everybody else was horribly evil, and they wanted to form their own societies, their own little communities. And that was very hard in England because Henry VIII and then his successors didn't trust anybody who was sort of so anti against the world, right? They thought that they were always plotting something, and actually it turns out they did. This is a picture of Oliver Cromwell, who was sort of a big one of the Calvinists who eventually would seize government from the royalty. So it wasn't without cause that there was suspicion of these people. So you had this one group who wanted to just break off altogether from the rest of society. And then you had the Puritans, who believed most of the same things. However, they thought that maybe the way to move forward was to stay living with their fellow people in England and just eliminate Catholic influences in the Anglican Church. Just let's just get rid of all the things we don't like about Catholicism and go forward from there. Now, that's not to say there weren't, these groups were huge. The Pilgrims were particularly small, because there was all the Anglos was probably the bulk of people, and there was still a bunch of Catholics around. It wasn't suddenly that people flipped the switch and all the Catholics stopped being faithful to the Catholic Church. It was helped also by the fact that some of the sovereigns were also Catholic. So you'd have a Protestant ruler, then you'd have a Catholic ruler, and back and forth, and they tended to murder their opponents. Matter of fact, that's actually something that's very important to remember here in all this, is that people kept murdering everybody they disagreed with. If you didn't like, even over so minor things, there were people who said that during the Eucharist, changing water, wine really became blood of Christ. And other people said it was as if it became the blood of Christ. It was more of a metaphor rather than a literal thing. Those people would shoot each other, kill each other, and hack each other to death for that one very minor, it seems to us from a distance, or maybe it's not even today. I mean, people think it's a major thing, but that's how great the problems were. So these folks, these Puritans and Pilgrims, are sitting in England. They don't like anybody around them. They think all of Europe was just completely corrupt and already gone to hell in a handbasket. Yet there were still Catholics everywhere. The kings distrusted you because they thought you were conspiring against them, because you were. And they decided they wanted to protect their children. So the first thing they did, at least for the Pilgrims, they went over to the Netherlands, which seems kind of silly from our perspectives. Even then, the Netherlands were notorious for being libertines and liberal compared to the English. But they went there. They went to Leyden. And they weren't happy there for a bunch of reasons. One is because there was still the corruption all around them, but now they didn't even have the protection of the English Channel from all the wars going on. And they thought any minute these folks would sweep down upon them and kill them all. But also their kids were beginning to assimilate into Dutch customs. They were afraid their kids were going to stop speaking English. They were going to start speaking Dutch. They would start acting like Dutch people. So at that point, they went back to England, and they decided they were going to go to the Western Hemisphere. I always hate to call it the New World, because being Mexican, and it seems to me that, why are we new? This part of the world, the Western Hemisphere, is just as new as the Eastern Hemisphere. So I use West versus East, but that's just my native blood in me. In any case, though, they decided to go to the emigrate, because there was all this land, and they thought that they could create their own world. But they weren't farmers, which is kind of a weird thing. But they thought that they could create these little farming villages and live by themselves and be away from all the problems of the world. So this is Governor Winthrop here, and one of the stranger things about these two groups is that they thought that the essential battle between the forces of God and the forces of Satan was going to take place right in Massachusetts. That this was the place. Europe was already too late. Asia and Africa, who knows what was wrong with them. But the final battle of humanity was going to be right here in Massachusetts. They also had other ideas. They thought everyone was a sinner. And this becomes important when you start talking about the reaction to same-sexual relations. They thought everyone was a sinner. You were born a sinner, you were going to die a sinner. And that there was nothing you could do to stop you from going to hell someday. It was a very strong sort of idea of predestination. You were born a sinner. No matter what you did in this world, you were going to remain a sinner. And then when you died, God was going to punish you. Sort of like, life was tough and then it's going to get worse. They also believed literally in every word in the Bible. This is right after, or not too long after the invention of the printing press, so people could finally actually afford Bibles. Before that, they were so expensive because they were handwritten out. But now everybody could read it. Everybody could know exactly what was in the Bible, word for word for word. Also, very importantly, they thought each congregation should independently come up with its ideas about the relationship between humanity and God. It wasn't up to each individual, but that listening to their clergy, they would come together and actually say, okay, this is what we're going to believe. This is how we're going to act. Now, it worked very well in these colonies because everybody thought the same, at least for a bit of time. So they knew that if the Plymouth group was thinking one thing and the Duxbury group would think the exact same way, that would come up with the same conclusions when interpreting the Bible. So it worked for a while here. But that's very important, as you'll see in a couple of minutes here. The other thing is that they very much believed in theocratic governments. So there was no separation between church and state. They were run by the clergy. They were in charge no matter what. So again, these Puritans and Pilgrims with this very dour outlook on life, very militaristic view of their religion. They were fighting against Satan here in the wilderness, very, very controlling of society. They became the Unitarians and the Congregationalists. Unitarians have split off. They split off in the 19th century, and they've come back together, and they've gone back. Anyway, all these different groups, but those are the two main heirs of the religion today. This is the Arlington Street Church. It's very important because a lot of the meetings that for gay rights will take place in this in that church. So now we're going to get to the legal codes. People didn't have the right just to set up their own government. Now, if you think about it, who gave you the power to tax? Who gave you the power to kill somebody or to incarcerate them? For the most part, colonies were governed via charters granted by the English government. That was the whole point of what most people have heard of the Mayflower Compact. When the Pilgrims first got here, they were north of the legal charter granted to the Virginia colony. So they were no longer governed by the laws that were enabled by that charter. So they had to come up with their own justification for their laws. And until the English government sort of ratified this new colony, they used this compact to govern themselves. But then, of course, they eventually did need to have some kind of English government sort of authorize everything. So periodically they would give them charters. And there were two colonies in what became Massachusetts. There's the Plymouth colony, basically that went up to about Braintree. And the Massachusetts Bay colony, which was supposedly between the Charles and the Merrimack River, but it expanded a bit over time, particularly because Massachusetts attracted many times as many folks as did the Plymouth colony. Now, the problem was that England was in chaos. And this is the time of the English Civil Wars. Kings would battle Parliament, Parliament would battle kings. Charles I was executed. Charles II was brought back in. Oliver Cromwell established a sort of, puritanical theocracy in England for a while. Each time the government changed, they invalidated all the old charters, and they would give them the colonies new charters. Actually, it even more complicated. At one point, the English government got frustrated with the number of colonies in New England. It was, our little states we have now, right? And they even sort of consolidated them together. That didn't work. They let them break apart again. So they kept Plymouth and Massachusetts together. So there's all these charters, and every time a new charter was granted, the local legislative body had to redo their legal code. So what you'll find, if you look in the record, is legal code after legal code after legal code every few years when the charters change. And almost all of them were very strongly that the local church, whether it be the Pilgrims Church in Plymouth or the Puritans churches in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, were synonymous with government. This began to change later on in the 18th century as we approached the new independence, when that hold of theocracy began to change. But for the longest time, government religion was the same. So you had these two colonies, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were founded by Puritans who actually let Anglicans in, or at least Anglicans were willing to go there to visit. That's not the case so much with the Plymouth Colony. One reason why it was so small, that it just wasn't attractive. Who wants to live among a bunch of religious crazies? I guess is what most Anglicans thought. But tens of thousands of people suddenly emigrated to Massachusetts Bay Colony from England, and included lots of Puritans. A lot of them were trying to escape persecution by the government, but also a lot of Anglicans themselves who thought, this is a great opportunity to go someplace new. It's very important to remember that in all these legal codes and everything else, because they did allow limited self-government. Well, they had to, because you couldn't control things from afar with communications of the day. Only men could vote. Usually property owners, blacks, Indians, and women could not. So in a sense, these don't represent the broad consensus of people. We don't really know what that might be, because we don't have a lot of Black, Indian, and women input into what their thoughts were on these laws. But they certainly reflected what mainstream men thought at the time. And the other colony was the Plymouth Colony. This is William Bradford here. Fewer immigrants, again, because other folks just wanted to avoid them for the most part. They didn't even like the Puritans, to be honest with you. They, the Puritans were soft on the Anglican and the Catholic Church and the whole thing. They were afraid that they just weren't strong enough. They lacked a backbone. In both these colonies, the colonies tended to spread by, well, you had so many people at a meeting house going, their churches going to something, and they would then break off in a group where people would move a few miles down the road and found a new town, and that's how they sort of spread across the landscape, along with massacring all the original inhabitants of the area. But so there was this small scale thing. And also, both of these colonies, the way people lived made a big difference in terms of being able to be in a same-sex relationship. There weren't apartment buildings. There were, most people lived in houses that sheltered more than just a small family there. Usually, there'd be all their servants, all their hired hands, anybody else would all sleep together in one big room. There wasn't a lot of privacy, which means two things. One is it made it very hard actually to have same-sex relations, if you think about it. And the other one is possible to hide, right? There's just no way. There was just no escape. Even in all that circumstances, though, people were ingenious to manage to do things. Because these codes were based on the Bible, Leviticus, they were made capital crimes. Time after time after time, the punishment for sodomy was death. There is no forgive wiggle room, right? In these supposedly these codes, right? Terrible. Interestingly, sodomy only applied to men. These folks couldn't conceive of women's sexuality in general. And the idea that I think two women would actually be attracted to each other and might act on that attraction, I think just wasn't even in their universe. And you might have asked them about, the general theory of relativity, and they probably would give that more thought than the idea that two women could love each other and want to be with each other. That all said, they kept passing these laws over and over again. They also had very strict rules about dressing as your unassigned gender. And to me, that's interesting, is because it tells you that there were people who were sort of challenging gender roles, in the 17th century, 18th century. Some people say this is sort of a new thing. It's really not, if you think about it. People have been doing this now for hundreds and hundreds of years. There have been people who have been challenging their genders assigned to them. And there are, people did do it, I guess you'd say. There are lots of cases in the records. The Talbot was a English ship. There were apparently 5 beastly sodomical boys. I'm not quite sure what that means. A lot of times people just sort of won't even say the word, right? They're afraid to say, all hell's breaking loose, right, in this town, without saying exactly who's doing what with whom. Those boys were sent back to England and their fate is unknown. In Plymouth Colony, there was a case brought in court. And we know all this because the court records that have survived, not all court records that have survived, but people have actually went through the record. Great scholars, I have to thank them for their work here. And which we are trying to find every single case. So there's this other one where John Alexander and Thomas Roberts in 1636. Now, one of the things, because all these laws are based upon English common law, is that there are very strict standards for when you could convict somebody of a capital crime. As you could imagine, the standard of evidence is much stronger. So it just can't be that one person says so-and-so did it. You needed 2 people to sort of bear witness to the crime. Now, unless both people involved in the whole sordid act both confessed, right, then there isn't enough evidence to actually put somebody to death. So that might be one reason what happened. What it turns out that a lot of these people, not the beastly sodomical boys, but John Alexander and William Kensley, and then these men and women in this group in 1642, is a lot of them actually challenged the authority of the clergy to run these colonies. And that might be as much as reason why these people ended up being prosecuted as whatever acts they might doing. In any case, none of these people were executed. A couple of them were whipped, others were banished, but no one was executed. Interestingly, though, there was a guy named Thomas Merton who sort of formed a rogue colony of his own called Marymount, up in where Braintree is now. And he was sort of a rogue guy. He was selling guns to the Indians. He was making money off of selling them liquor. He was letting men and women dance together, and all sorts of horrible, horrible things. Dancing would be one of the worst things you could possibly do if you were a Puritan or a Pilgrim. And so eventually they went in and banished him to England, though he did sneak back. And then he was placed in house arrest and everything else. But they never killed him. But they did accuse him of being gay. And part of the evidence for that is that he let men and women dance together. Go figure, right? If you can't see me, I'm shrugging my shoulders. I don't understand it. But anyway, that might be one of the first cases of gay baiting, right? Of gay bashing in politics in North America. Was this poor guy who was sort of railroaded out of town. But again, the important thing was that no one was ever executed. There were dozens of men executed in other colonies. Virginia was kind of into that whole thing. Hundreds, if not thousands, of men in England over the decades and centuries before it became not a capital crime were also executed, and they would execute heretics, Baptists, Quakers at the drop of a hat. They didn't seem to care. So they didn't have a fear of capital punishment. It wasn't like they just didn't want to do it, but for whatever reason they didn't. And that says a lot about what was going on in all this time. So the real question is why? Why didn't they? Again, there was the evidence problem that you really needed. If you needed two people to sort of say it, there were no windows, right? Because glass was expensive, so you have to walk in on somebody and then get somebody to confess. I mean, it just was very hard. But also, in terms of the religion, it's important to remember that there's no concept of homosexuality. It wasn't that there were gay people, lesbian people as people, as there were, say, Italian people and Polish people or Irish people. There was no concept of homosexuality. People knew that people did these sorts of acts, obviously. Why put up a law if there was no problem? But there was no idea that this person was gay. It was good. So it was their act that was the problem. So that meant that, if you wouldn't necessarily kill a thief, you wouldn't think the thieves would keep on stealing, right? So you wouldn't necessarily think these people would keep on doing these things. So people thought that these folks could still be saved. And they thought also that everybody could succumb to temptation. It's like, well, he did it well, there's no reason why I couldn't do it as well. So that kind of created some mercy in New England, at least. It didn't help people further south. It didn't help people in England, but for some reason, it helped. There was that quality of mercy already emerging among the folks in Massachusetts. One thing you should know about me personally is that if I don't like you, I put up the ugliest pictures I could find of you. This is Supreme Court Justice Scalia. And I put him up here because when same-sex marriage and sodomy came up before the Supreme Court of the United States in the 21st century, this man would quote the statutes in the Massachusetts law that called for capital crime. So even though these laws weren't rigorously enforced, they still had impacts for hundreds of years afterwards. They've influenced our legal codes. And I think also important is to remember that this was horrible for the people involved. I mean, if maybe you didn't know of anybody being put to death, but it was there, right? It colored people's minds. It frightened people. It deadened people's lives. So there were impacts beyond just what went on in New England. And again, it got brought up in the Supreme Court years later. So now we're going to get back into this whole thing about why did they liberalize? And there's a bunch of reasons. One of the biggest reasons is actually that eventually these churches were disestablished. In other words, they no longer got money from taxpayers in their towns to support them. They had to compete with other religions. So they had, first they had to compete with the Anglicans, but then they had to, with the Baptists and the Presbyterians and all these other folks. Weren't a lot of Catholics at it in Massachusetts. And then when you have to compete, it becomes kind of hard, right? If your religion says that you're doomed from the birth, and everything you're going to do is not going to prevent you from going to hell. If your religion says that, and the guy preaching next door says, if you accept Jesus Christ as your personal savior, you'll go to heaven. What rational person would stay with the one? They had to lighten up. The Puritans and the Pilgrims didn't celebrate Christmas. They thought it was a pagan holiday. So again, are you going to go with the people who don't want to give presents? Or are you going to go with the people who do, want to put up a tree? They didn't put up trees yet, but want to celebrate. That played a big role, that competition. played a good role in them beginning to sort of loosen some of the bigger strictures on their lives. The other thing is that, remember, I said that each congregation had their own relationship to God. Well, that kind of began to transform. So we said, well, why is it the congregation as a whole? Shouldn't it be each person? And that's really what brought these folks down into a sort of a more liberal life outlook. Each person had to come up with their own ideas of how they were related to God and what God's presence meant on earth. And so once you open up to everybody's own interpretation, the world opens up, right? And people begin to say, well, maybe the Bible isn't literal, but maybe it's metaphoric. Maybe it has lessons to teach us, but we don't have to follow each word. Particularly good because people more and more begin to learn that there were different translations of the Bible that differed in wording. So then you really would be messed up. The other thing that began to change things in Massachusetts was slavery. Massachusetts was the first state to outlaw slavery. They actually did a very interesting thing. They did it through judicial acts, not through legislative acts. Again, you see this coming up with same-sex marriage here, right? Slavery, it turns out, is such a horrible thing. It's such a horribly warped society that you have to, you can't just say, okay, slaves are allowed. You actually need a whole legal code to support it. You need to say, that slaves can't bring lawsuits, that slaves can't, free themselves, that you need laws to say what happens to children to slavery. You need laws to say what happens to children where one parent is a slave and one person is free. You need this whole infrastructure. You need to be able to enforce a contract with a slave. And in this, John Adams, the great patriot, wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, and he made it so that every person, didn't say just, freehold people or non-slaves, but every person has certain rights. And so in the 1780s, before at the end of the Civil War, probably end of the War for Independence, but before the country was established, the Massachusetts courts, through a series of rulings, negated all the laws that supported slavery. So slavery became impossible to enforce in Massachusetts. And that's actually how it is to this day. We don't have I don't think we have any prohibition of slavery. It's just impossible to do. It's also, by the way, important to note that not all of Boston and Massachusetts was abolitionists. You might think that. But certainly the predominant ethic became that way. And that also created a liberalization of the old line Yankee religions. And then of course the other liberal causes like fair labor laws and tariffs and whatnot. That's just sort of generally kept pushing them to become more liberal. Now we're getting to the transition here between the two eras that we'll be talking about. For a while, Boston and Massachusetts was probably one of the most accepting places in Western civilization. Most accepting places for gay and lesbian people. This is Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields, these two women who were part of the cream of Yankee literary society in Boston at one point. They lived together for years, and they were invited to places as couples. There were a lot of male couples. You probably heard some stuff about Isabel Stewart Gardner and her friends with these male couples and whatnot. But there were a lot that men could show up with other men at an event. They couldn't quite live together the way women could, because remember, women were thought not to be able to have sex. When women didn't have any sexual desire, they were non-sexual beings. So that makes it very different. But for a while there, Boston and Massachusetts were so accepting. And there's a caveat, right? These people were upper class, white, Protestant. It was a big thing of don't ask, don't tell, right? No one would say to Sarah and Annie Fields, right? Hey, did you women get it on last night or something? No, it was always very, very, chaste about the whole thing. But for the longest time, it seemed like it was, there was acceptance. And you can imagine an alternative world where this acceptance grew, right? And not just for the upper class who kept it on the down low, but it got, let's say maybe poorer people. There was actually a Catholic woman at the time who was another lesbian. They all treated her like dirt because she was Catholic. Didn't they wouldn't let her, in with the other women. But anyway, you keep thinking what would have happened in the 1890s into the beginning of the 20th century if this tolerance grew. It didn't. It collapsed during World War I. There were a series of crackdowns. The U.S. government through the Navy started spying on people, or they made they shamed the Boston police into arresting people in various places for being gay. It was never as bad as other places, but there was a crackdown at Harvard. There was another crackdown in Newport. Everybody knew this world was coming to an end, and it did, and it created 50 years of very, very bad times, similar to what it was elsewhere. Though the laws in Boston were still a little bit more liberal. In New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, it was illegal even to have an establishment, a bar, where you let in known homosexuals. In Boston, they didn't care. Once, before and after Prohibition, that was never a problem. You could have, they raided gay bars and they would harass people at gay bars, but they wouldn't shut them down just because they were gay. So there was always this little bit of a more liberal acceptance here than else places. Going on in the churches, conservative whites were sort of offered this opportunity with Baptist and Methodist churches began to grow in numbers. This is actually a guy named Henry Morgan. For those of you who heard of Morgan Memorial, it's named after him. He founded a church. He called it the People's Church. And he was just repeat every nasty anti-Catholic thing you could imagine. Priests were, seducing young girls and selling them into prostitution kinds of things. Just a horrible, horrible thing. And he would be preaching there. Matter of fact, at one point, Boston was really probably the center of evangelicalism in the United States, believe it or not. The South End. I mean, these people came back today. What would they think? That kind of the mainline churches, the Anglicans, the Unitarians, and the Congregationalists didn't like these people. They thought they were kind of bad and nasty and low class. Matter of fact, they even passed a law, made it illegal to preach on the common. And Henry Morgan and a bunch of his friends actually did civil disobedience and sort of fight off that law. But they died. Those churches declined and disappeared over time. We don't have big Baptist and Methodist churches here. In a sense, there was no market for them. Because you think about it, the Yankees, the various folks, descendants of the English settlers, still liked their mainline denominations. They felt no need to change. And new immigrants that were coming in were either Catholic, because they were Irish or Italian, or they were Jewish. So there was no sort of market. There was no niche that they could possibly have filled. So this is very important for going forward here. We didn't have the really conservative churches that other parts of the country have. The other point thing is that the Catholic Church collapsed at the end of the 20th century. I don't know if folks here who are old enough or lived here at the time, but this was the center of the church scandals that would eventually rock across the country, if not the world here. This happened in the context of Yankee versus Irish politics. People used to say, what does Lake Street say? And that was, Lake Street was the home where the Cardinals lived. And they would sort of say something, and, Irish folks, Italians would just vote whatever they said. The Cardinals said to vote. But then the Catholic Church collapsed. The membership was way down, fraction of what it used to be. And it also changed. By the 1990s, it was becoming more Latinx and Portuguese and Haitian, which are perhaps more the conservative than you might think, but they also don't have that sort of dour Catholicism that was sort of associated with more the Irish strain of Catholicism. Latinx people don't really believe, these old stories about, kids at Catholic school being hit by the nuns with rulers and whatnot. That wouldn't go over anymore with their new membership. So their membership changed. And very importantly, because of this loss of focus and money and authority, they had less control than they once did over elected officials. So here we are in 2000. We have no big influential mass evangelical leaders. I mean, to this day, can you really name somebody who could march into City Hall or the State House and sort of say, pick some evangelical, thing that they're in favor of? We just don't have that. And the Catholic Church was in disarray. However, we still have that strong network of liberal Protestant and Jewish congregations. They have survived. They have pressures of their own. Some congregations have closed, some churches have gone away, but there's much stronger network than we did elsewhere. Meanwhile, the LGBTQ community in Boston was always very special. For one thing, again, it was never that oppressed like it was in other places, but it also had a strong relationship with colleges and universities. Going away to college for both men and women was one way you could avoid having to get married young. At a time when, particularly women, right? If you graduate from high school, you got to get married at 18, 19, right? Well, this was a way of escaping that kind of thing. So it's always attracted large numbers of women who were free thinkers at the very minimum, right? And for those reasons and others, just because it was a big city and everything else, it attracted a large number of activists. At one point, almost every major city had an LGBTQ, a queer organization that was run by a alumni of Boston, of a Boston group, whether it be Gay Community News or the Homophile League or Daughters of Bilitis, just all these different groups. They all had strong presence here, and that community was organized. They knew what to do. They began to form political alliances. I'll talk about these two groups in a minute. In the 70s, their first goal was anti-discrimination laws, because there were none in Massachusetts like elsewhere. And from the beginning of the 70s, they began to agitate in a place. Now, one of the interesting things is why marriage, right? Why did LGBTQ people want it? And you'll see in a couple slides, that became controversial at a certain point. GLAAD, gay lesbian advocates and defenders, actually once put together a thing that over 800 laws privileged married people. There was one of the most heart-rending things was a bunch of high-profile cases where somebody would, there was a woman that was Sharon Kowalski in Minnesota, who was in a traffic accident and was in a semi-vegetative state. Not completely. She was sort of conscious of it, but she couldn't really express herself. Her parents blocked her lover of 20 years from going and seeing her, because you had no rights as a couple. For gay men, it was AIDS. Somebody would die. They were on the partner wasn't on the lease or wasn't on the mortgage, and the families would come in and just disenfranchise any kind of rights for the surviving person. You had no rights. If you died and you're not married, your heirs are your parents, or your kids, or your siblings, right? The lover, the partner, whatever you want to call them, had zero rights. For lesbians, it was much more than men, though men started to do this as well. The children were an issue. Suppose the other mommy wants to pick up the kid at school. Well, they can't, because they don't have any rights, right? How do you sign them up to get whatever? And what happens to one kid gets, one parent gets sick? Health insurance was a big issue, right? You couldn't put your other folks on the health insurance. And so how do you protect your kids? And also, interesting enough, if you don't have marriage, you can't get divorced. The advantage of divorce is that there's a standard legal way of dividing up property and deciding disputes in property. if you're not married, you can't use any of those things. You can't go to court and say, you know, I want my 50%, or I want my 80%, or, you know, or I want my 10%, right? You don't have any standing. You can't, the judge can't adjudicate it. So it actually made breakups very difficult if you were in a same-sex relationship. So there are a lot of reasons going in the 80s and 90s. More and more lesbians were having kids. AIDS was a bigger problem. Health insurance costs were rising. All these different things. Meanwhile, same-sex marriage had a brief flirtation in Hawaii in 1993, which was quickly slammed down, but did prompt the federal government, and this is Bill Clinton signing the damn thing, the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, in 1996, which basically said that the federal government does not have to, will not recognize same-sex marriage, and no state has to follow those rules as well. So people try to do everything, workarounds. And Vermont came out with something called civil unions, which, you know, gave in Vermont, if you signed up for one, all the things that the state could do in terms of granting marriage rights. So you could get divorced, for example, but you couldn't deduct the cost of your health insurance for your spouse, for example, that you might want to do. Similarly, there was something called domestic partner benefits, which is a way of whatever workplace-based benefits you got, you could give to other folks. So your domestic partner, right? If you're in a relationship with another man or another woman, you could say, okay, so-and-so is my domestic partner. I want to give them health insurance, and they would put you on the health insurance. You had to pay extra, but whatever. And you had to pay taxes on the value of that, but that's another thing. Strangely enough, you couldn't do that in Boston. Public entities, you know, cities and towns, school districts, whatever you want to, the state itself. There was a law in Massachusetts that said the only people who could get health benefits were, you know, a spouse or child, you know, and it had to be your child on the birth certificate. So I couldn't, if I was with somebody, they had a kid, you couldn't do it. None of that was possible. And that needed to be fixed in the legislature. When Boston tried to get it, work around it, the court said no. And they went to the legislature in the 90s, and the Massachusetts legislature refused to do anything about it. They blocked it. So things were pretty bleak here. So a coalition formed. This is Arlene Isaacson, the Massachusetts Gay Lesbian Political Caucus, and she began working as a lobbyist for gay, lesbian, queer causes in the State House in the early 1980s. And she was the one who eventually shepherded and got the anti-discrimination law passed, or other things. She got some judges put in, did a lot of work. She was instrumental in the battles that are going to follow. Mary Bonato, you'll see in a second here, she's with the Gay Lesbian Advocates and Defenders. She was the lead attorney, and Holly Gunner was another big attorney from ACLU. Interesting, most national gay rights organizations were against Massachusetts trying to do anything here, because they were afraid that Massachusetts was the most liberal state. If they failed to get a gay marriage law in Massachusetts, it would be a disaster for everyone. So this is Mary Bonato, great woman. So GLAAD began to lay the groundwork for this lawsuit. They kind of did some administrative battles with like Department of Labor in the state and what else. The caucus perfected this lobbying things. Everybody was angered by the failure of domestic partner benefits in the legislature. Civil unions aren't accepted by other states. They aren't accepted by the federal government. They didn't do anything, right? And there was also fear that opponents might strike first by putting some law on the books or a constitutional amendment to sort of outlaw same-sex marriage before anything could happen. And that would make it harder to change the law. So they put out the call. They got 7 couples that go through a screening process to be part of this, different ages, different genders, different races, everything else. And they filed suit, Goodrich versus Department of Public Health, on April 11th, 2001. It's against the Department of Public Health because they administer marriage certificates and vital statistics in the Commonwealth. On November 18th, the Supreme Judicial Court, remember, there's the General Court, the Supreme Judicial Court, the state Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. And Margaret Marshall famously said, civil marriage is a personal commitment to another person and a public celebration of ideals like companionship, intimacy, and fidelity. This has become actually something that's read in heterosexual marriage ceremonies now. It's such a beautiful thing, she said. That turned out to be the easy part. People sort of think, okay, they did this right. We got married, all got married May 17th. I personally got married on the 21st. It was a 3-day waiting period, and we wanted to wait until Friday so more family could show up. Everybody think that this was really easy. That was the easy part. It got really bad after this, and that's when the real battle began. So there are different things they could do, their opponents. They could do legal strategies, they could file suits, or they could do legislative strategies. The court challenges failed. In the state courts, the Supreme Judicial Court said that civil unions were not really the same as marriage. You couldn't just say, well, let's have civil unions and let's go on with our lives here. No. They actually said that you only could eliminate same-sex marriage by a constitutional amendment. Federal courts came in much later. This is Windsor and everything else. But that was many, many years later, 2013, 2015, and really only because Massachusetts and other states began to have same-sex marriage and other states didn't. And it just became a madness in terms of whether you were legally married or not, if you were in one of these marriages. But opponents did work hard. Finally, after all this, they offered civil unions as a compromise, and that they would let there be domestic partner benefits. Governor Romney, Mitt Romney, who was governor at the time, was really against it. He kept threatening to do everything on earth to stop it all. People were in a quandary. So they couldn't go through a law. They couldn't just pass a law, say no gay marriage, or just let's have civil unions. The Supreme Judicial Court said no. Now there are 200 people in the Massachusetts legislature. There are 40 state senators, 160. They sit as a constitutional convention once each year, each legislative session. And there are two ways to approve an amendment. One is you can get 101 votes, majority, in 2 succeeding sessions. In other words, 2 years in a row. Poof. That's just if some representative or senator introduces a bill for a constitutional amendment, it gets considered at the Constitutional Convention. That's one way. The other way is that you get a petition. You can go out there, you gather signatures, and then you present it to the legislature sitting as a constitutional convention, and then you only need 51 votes. So you need 150 people to oppose this darn thing if you're gonna preserve marriage, right? After all that happens, if the gag gets approved, then it goes to a vote. No one wanted to vote because all over the place, people were losing these political battles. Remember, this is the early 2000s, late 90s, and everybody all consistently kept losing these things. So there was a group called the Religious Coalition for the Freedom to Marry. It was organized in 1993, but didn't really do much for the longest time. And then with Goodridge's decision came around, they suddenly just sprang to life as being a powerful lobbyist. 700 congregations were part of this. Virtually every Congregationalist and Unitarian congregation were part of it, Jewish things, a lot of other folks. 1,000 people signed it. Again, I told you, if I don't like you, you get an ugly picture. This is Tom Finneran, who was the Speaker of the House. So the 2004, now, marriage has been going on for several months. This is towards the end of the year. Only 50 legislators were certain. When Arlene Isaacson counted who was in favor, and they had a dossier on each person, who they were, where they from, what religion they said they were, people in their district who could lobby them. They did their homework, right? The legislative leadership was against marriage. Again, the national allies, the Human Rights Fund, everybody else kept saying, let's just stop this because you're going to lose. And then marriage will be set back in this country for 100 years. So everything was against these folks. So they have the first constitutional convention. Everybody flooded the State House. There were people singing, dancing. There were a group of anti-marriage folks who followed poor Arlene around going, evil, evil, and pointing fingers at her the whole time. Arlene came up with this idea with allies. Let's push for a civil union amendment because everybody hates that, right? The conservatives hate it because it's acknowledging same-sex relationships altogether. The pro-marriage people hate it because didn't really give you the rights they needed. Let's push that forward. And went forward. It passes 105 to 92. Arlene actually counts reasons why they voted against it. What not? Says we now have 83. So I want to go back. We had 50 there before. Now we have 83. We've jumped. Remember that magic number is eventually going to be 150. We're still a long way to protect things. The elections in 2004, national in a disaster for pro-marriage people. Defeated virtually everywhere it was on the ballot, whether to proposing it or just to stopping it before anybody could propose it. But in Massachusetts, all the pro-marriage legislatures were reelected. And to help things out, Tom Fitterman was indicted and had to resign. Yay, right? So now we're at the second constitutional convention. And again, everybody hates civil unions, so it fails 39 to 157. And now look, we're up to 120. We're getting close, right? This also means that the anti-marriage people have to go the other route to get a amendment on the ballot. They have to collect signatures, but it means they only need 51 votes. So as you see, they have 80 votes, and they only need 51. So in the second intermission here, they actually ended up getting 125,000 signatures. That's more than twice as many as they needed. However, in the 2006 elections, we have 4 more pro-marriage legislators elected. We had about 124. But remember, we got to get it. You only need 51 votes to lose, right? You need 150. We're 26 below. I put this thing up here because in these years, it was really difficult for same-sex married people in Massachusetts. If you went to another state, your marriage wasn't recognized. So if you move for work or something, you're out of luck. You actually had to file your taxes separately. Massachusetts, you had to file as married or whatever, married living apart, whatever the other one is. And in federal, you had to file as single. And so everything, life was just difficult in these years for these same-sex couples. On the third constitutional convention, the pro-marriage forces tried to stop the amendment by not having a vote. They thought, let's not have a constitutional convention this year. Well, Governor Romney went to the Supreme Judicial Court, filed suit, and the SJC said there had to be a vote. You have to have a constitutional convention. So on January 2nd, the very last day of the legislative session, they passed the amendment 62 to 134. Now we're up to 134. We've jumped up again, but they still do it. One more chance. There's one more chance to stop the whole thing. And we are 12 votes away from that, 16 votes away from that, right? So finally, on the fourth constitutional convention. Now, part of the problem is that as you start getting closer and closer, you start, all the easy votes have been gotten, right? I mean, anybody was kind of leaning your way. The last remaining folks, you had to sort of fight for each one. We were up to 144. We still needed 6 more. On the other hand, the plus side, the Democratic establishment, Governor Deval Patrick was now governor. He was pro same-sex marriage. Most of the legislative leadership had turned over when Fitterman was indicted. They all were in favor. They didn't want to have a referendum. They thought that would mess up the vote in 2008, and they didn't want that to happen. So they were trying to keep it off the ballot as well. Strangely enough, the left wing of the LGBT community began to waver. There are always people who why marriage? Why are we fighting for marriage? Why don't we just get rid of the marriage privilege? Why are we fighting for the right to have health insurance? Why don't we just make health insurance for all? I mean, they're all valid things. Who are these, wealthy gay men and lesbian people who want this just to save money? So that, and the slightest crack in the coalition that was putting this together terrified everybody. Like, what happens to the opponents say, well, these gay people over there oppose it. Why are we're just supporting our gay brothers and sisters who don't want to have marriage, right? So there was all these problems. So the very last vote, the night of the Sunday before, pardon me, the Roman Catholic bishops issue a letter to the legislature. It goes out to each one of their constituents. It's read at the churches all across the Commonwealth on that Sunday opposing marriage. Thousands of people were at the Common. They were in more people than could fit in the State House. But significantly and very moving was a church service at St. Paul's Cathedral, which was all these different clergy came in, and then they marched across the Common. These clergy, it was very moving. I get choked up when I remember that day. And they were singing, "We are marching in the light of God." And they marched to the State House in support of marriage. And the amendment failed, 45 to 151. And so that's really the arc of these people who, profess to want to kill people for same-sex relationships, same-sex period, right? We are marching to the light of God in support of them several hundred years later. And it's the same people spiritually. They really made that change, that transition for the better. So again, this sort of sums all up here. We had these people very strict, but they had an ideology that would sort of set them on this path towards liberalism. Conservative religions failed to be a political force in the state, and the liberal clergy were involved in the pro-marriage fight to that very last day. And this is just a shameless plug for my book. If you want to do something, you can also look up my stuff on russlopez.com or follow me on what was once known as Twitter at Russ and Harrison. And I'll turn it over there for questions.
Well, thank you so much. That was fascinating and so comprehensive. We do have a couple of questions already in the chat. One relates to the decline of Boston marriages in the early 20th century. And the question from Susan Wilson is, weren't Freud's writings a major reason for the decline in Boston marriages?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one reason why they were tolerated was that they were thought to be sexless. But once they realized that women did have sexuality, and that and they had yearnings just as or even more heartfelt than men, compared to men. But the fact that they weren't these folks who were just without lust in their hearts, I guess you'd say, that they were capable of lust, which is like any human being, which Freud said, that everybody has sexuality. Then you couldn't really ignore the whole thing, right? It's like, ooh, geez, these people really must be doing something there, and that was also very much responsible for the decline in acceptance of Boston marriages.
Susan also notes that speaking of women escaping to colleges, there were so-called Wellesley marriages that were the same as Boston marriages. Oh
yeah, actually, Wellesley was sort of the center, and they did so many great people came out of that. There was Catherine Porter, who wrote the lyrics that became America the Beautiful. There were the women who founded settlement houses across Boston. There was the poets, just absolutely a renaissance of women arts and letters and science from that time. And it also declined when they got a new president of Wellesley, who decided he had to crack down on these women living with other women, or that same crackdown.
And then our next question kind of jumps forward to the defeat of that constitution, that vote. The question is about the clergy who came together in that service in March and singing. And it was, who was the highest ranking clergy member who attended in the church hierarchy?
Oh, I think it would probably be Reverend Gomes. I think he was, I'm not quite sure what the term is, but he was head of the diocese for the Episcopal Church in Massachusetts. And he was a gay man himself. He was also at Harvard for a while, and he was probably the highest ranking. I mean, it's hard to say, like Jewish congregations don't have any kind of hierarchy. So I know we actually got married at Temple Israel on the Riverway, and the rabbis there were all very much involved in the battle for same-sex marriage. Matter of fact, at my particular ceremony with my now husband, the rabbi goes, when it came time to break the glass, because there were a lot of reasons for this. Some people say it's to be hard to dissolve this marriage. Is to put the glass back together. Other people say it's to ward off evil spirits. So this breaking of the glass is for Mitt Romney, and we smashed the glass. So there's a little bit of politics in that as well. So it's hard to say who was the highest rank. I mean, certainly, you don't have like a Catholic hierarchy like in this Protestant things, but I'd probably be Gomes would be the highest.
So if anyone else has a question to put in the chat, I mean, now would be the time. Patrick, I know you had a couple of questions that you were.
Yeah, I was curious about your research. So a lot of this, being kind of a niche understanding, something that isn't readily available. Can you talk a little about your research and how you unearthed a lot of this information that you got? Because I'm certain it must have taken a lot of work.
Yeah, it took me like 4 or 5 years to write the book, to do the research. I stood on the shoulders of giants, as they say. A lot of people have done the real grunt work of, let's say, going through all the cases that are available from the early records of the Plymouth Colony or the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the court systems and whatnot. So I didn't have to do that. Other people have done sort of that legal analysis. Other folks have written extensively about the history of the church, but a lot of this is actually buried in other things. So that I can't remember the name of the author, but there's a woman wrote a book called Evangelicals at the Crossroad, which is about the evangelical movement in Boston in the second half of the 19th century. And it's a brilliant book, but she has a lot of issues to cover, not just ones that would then have. She didn't cover what the implications were for same-sex marriage or for acceptance of gay people. So you have to kind of pull out the facts of that one. A lot of folks have written Boston history. Very few of them have mentioned LGBTQ people. And you find things like in archives at Harvard. There was one of the crackdowns was at Harvard of Harvard students in 1921, and the students' testimony tells you a lot about what was going on in gay life in Boston at the time. That's actually one of the problems, because Boston didn't arrest people like New York did. When New York City researchers want to do things, they have like a huge number of arrest records to go through. But we didn't arrest anybody. I think like there was like there was a peak of arrests in World War I, then it went down, and then another peak of arrests in World War II. But let's say like 1930, 1931, the number of people arrested for things that even disorderly conduct or whatever that might be close to it, or, you drill down to it, not that many people got arrested. So you don't get a lot of information about these folks. A lot of diaries, which are fun to read sometimes. Sometimes they're dull. Isabel Stewart Gardner probably has the most dullest readings of anybody who's famous in Boston, right? Her best friend went to an anti-lynching rally at Faneuil Hall, and the letters between the two of them over the next 5 days are like, Well, I'm trying to decide if I'm gonna take the 10 o'clock or the 11 o'clock train to Gloucester. Like, ask her what she felt, what was going on here, and there's nothing. So I mean, some things are great. Other things, you read these novels, I don't know, these diaries and stuff. You go like, oh my god, these people were having fun. So it's a very interesting thing. It's very gratifying. I got to go all over the place. That's the other part that was great about it. New York, I went down to Washington and read archives to the National Archives, all of major library here. A lot of stuff was put together actually by the Athenaeum, believe it or not.
Well, I guess I want to offer a couple of final words. I want to thank Russ again for such an informative presentation. But I also want to thank Patrick for pulling together such a wonderful speaker series event that looks at, we've been looking at revolutions all year long. And I think that the revolution as it affected the LGBTQ plus community that led to same-sex marriage equality. I think that this particular speaker series was a brilliant look at that issue and at the way revolutions can be perceived now. So thank you very, very much to both of you. And we'll look forward to seeing, I hope, a lot of you next month at our talk about the Haitian Revolution. So good night, everybody.